And now that we talked about some of the current issues in the media world, we're going to go back and going to give you an overview, kind of a sweeping overview of how media have developed. New ones have come along, old ones have died out or changed in the USA since colonial times. Yes, and there's a flag and a TV set. Okay. So the top line is out of home was the first kind of medium that was around pretty much everywhere. In Europe, yes, of course, there were books after Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, and there were sheets that people would print and pass around, and people would read to one effect or another. In fact, Martin Luther, I think, tacked up one of those sheets on the door of a church and started Protestantism, which you may know begins with the word protest. This was against the Catholic Church. But with out of home, those sheets were glued up in places in towns where people congregated and where lots of people would see them. And so you could get news there. You could also see ads for different things. So out of home was really first. And then gradually these little local newspapers in the colonies at that point. In fact, Benjamin Franklin's brother was a printer, and Benjamin Franklin at a very young age, he had a very big family, by the way, and they weren't wealthy in Boston. Benjamin Franklin apprenticed to his brother. He was supposed to, I think, spend 7 years working for almost no pay, but he at the printing shop. But he left early and went his own way and actually made his fortune by going to Philadelphia and starting a printing business. And because of his intellect and his charm and everything else he offered, he befriended the most important people in the town of Philadelphia, got all kinds of government, printing business, etc. And they did print newspapers. His brother did, and so did he. So did a number of printers. They were normally 2 sheets, so it was 4 pages, back and front of 2 pages. They'd come out once a week. Wouldn't cost very much. And, of course, the news from Europe, they got on boats. So it took a couple of months for a boat in those days to cross the Atlantic. So the news they got from Europe was about 2 months old. And gradually newspapers got bigger and had more pages, and printing got better and was eventually mechanized. And so newspapers into the 19th century became the primary medium and contained lots of news and lots of information and were a vehicle for all kinds of communication. Then magazines. And then with the taming of electricity, I won't say the invention of it because it's a natural phenomenon, but with AC and DC current and the understanding of radio waves, electricity together with radio waves meant that people were able to send sounds out wirelessly, and you could pick them up miles away and listen. And that was radio. And before too long, radio was monetized and ran advertising, and there were networks. And then someone discovered how to send not just sound, but pictures across the radio waves, same radio spectrum, just a different part of it. And that was television. So wirelessly sending sounds and images miles and miles and hundreds of miles was television. And then the internet, I guess you all know about that pretty well. At first it was called the Information Superhighway, and revolutionized things. And then mobile phones. And by the way, mobile phones also use radio waves to communicate. We don't go around with long wires, I think we all recognize. So they're using something wireless, and those are radio waves, once again. Radio waves. And I am very interested in, and you should be too, intrigued by how changes in technology brought about changes in media types. So, as I said before, Gutenberg's movable type printing press kind of began things with books and leaflets and posters. Next big thing that happened was hundreds of years later, where people figured out how to put steam to work to move machines, to move locomotives and move machinery. And steam power, first of all, locomotives, if you think about it, trains were a huge phenomenon in the 19th century, in the early and mid and late 19th century. And I'm sure you may know that the first transcontinental railroad in the United States, which was built by lots of it, particularly in the western part, by Chinese laborers who were not treated well, weren't allowed to become citizens, by the way. That was huge, opened up vistas of the country to everything, to being able to ship for business purposes, people moving around. And the first sort of precursor of radio was something called the telegraph, SOS, etc. This was done by the tapping telegraph key, which sent electrical currents along wires, and different bursts of current were different letters. And this was the first kind of electronic communication, but it was by wire. And these wires were strung along railroad beds because they had the right of way and they covered lots of land. So steam power contributed to the advent of the telegraph. AC and DC current, we talked about, radio waves, and anyway, we've talked about all this stuff. The technology and advances in technology that led to advances and changes in the media landscape. So this is the radio wave spectrum. And almost everything that's wireless is working on radio waves, as it says here. Even your garage door opener has a certain part of the radio spectrum. And radio spectrum is determined by the size of the wave that's sent. And so you've got 3 kilohertz, 500 megahertz, you have gigahertz. And by the way, 5G will also be on this spectrum when it's launched, and I'm sure you've all heard of that. But here you can see the different things. I mean, GPS satellite systems work. Cell phones, you see where those are, the kind of green thing on the left. AM radio, way down, 535 kilohertz to 1700 kilohertz. Remote-controlled toys are on the radio spectrum. So all these devices that are being run and working wirelessly are using the radio spectrum. Pretty interesting. And a hertz, as you can see, is 1 cycle per second. Okay. The radio spectrum. They're all around you. Wave your arms around wherever you are. And there are radio waves all around. Okay. So, that's the top overview. Now we're going to dig a little bit more into each medium. And I'm going to show you some examples and talk a little bit more specifically about each thing as we go through it. So this is called a posted bill. So this was the one-page printed item, printed on paper. So obviously paper production and paper factories were another big factor in the growth of out-of-home and then the growth of newspapers. So you had to have a printer, but you had to have ink and you had to have paper. So there was increased paper manufacturing in Europe that came along with these movable printing presses, and in the United States. So this poster actually did not run in the U.S., it ran in London. Nova Britannia, New Britain. And this was an ad to join the Roanoke colony and sail to the United States. And Exciting all such as will be effective to further the same. Excellent fruits by planting in Virginia. So there's a very old poster which had an impact on the U.S. Did not run in the U.S. though. Whoa, this one's scary. This is another older poster, but we've jumped up by a couple hundred years. So this is World War I. This is another one-sheet out-of-home poster that ran to promote enlistment in the United States Army in World War I. Now, so this is a piece of paper again. This time it's color, and it's glued up around a city in places where people congregate. And I would bring your attention to this, although it's kind of startling and kind of gross, I think you could say. It's a very artistically created thing. Interesting headline, a brutal visual, but it grabs your attention. So, in fact, if you think back to, turn of the century Paris and United States and Europe, a lot of these one-sheet posters were really quite artistic and beautiful, and many of them are collected for different things. I'm sure you've seen them. This is advancing again another 100 or so years. This is what's called a bulletin. It's a big out-of-home format. It's probably 20 by 60 feet. It's on a highway. These tend to cost a fair amount of money. They're some of the most expensive out-of-home advertising because they reach a lot of people on major highways. The more people they reach, the more they cost. But this is the kind of impression that basically you're going to have maybe 3 or 4 seconds to see it. So it has to work very quickly and get the message across. And the most effective out-of-home, which we'll get into when we discuss out-of-home in the next class, is not just boring sort of flat statements. And they're things that make you think a little bit. And this one, I think, makes you think a little bit. Please don't eat the billboard, okay? And there's a lot of appetite appeal on the sandwich. Okay. And guess what? This is out-of-home advertising, too. This is, what do they call those machines that clean the ice? You guys know what they are. So this is sponsored by Gillette razors. So they're actually cleaning the ice at a hockey game with a big Gillette razor, the Fusion razor. So someone had a pretty cool idea to get Gillette Fusion to sponsor this hockey team or this hockey game. It's out-of-home advertising. But it's big and dramatic, and it's unavoidable. You're at the hockey game. And here's another. Now, a lot of out-of-home advertising, particularly in indoor spaces, is going digital now, with screens where you can either run a video or you can change the creative pretty frequently. And so this is an example of one of these indoor networks. I think it might be an airport. Maybe it's a mall with an out-of-home ad. So out-of-home has gone from, bills, one-sheet bills glued up. A lot of it is actually becoming digital now. Even the highway signs, I think, a number of you have seen them, are going digital. So, and more about that when we talk about out-of-home. So, local newspapers. This is an early newspaper from Pennsylvania. And I talked about these. It's 2 pages, 4 sides, comes out weekly, pretty cheap. Really old news from Europe, but it was the fastest they could get it. And ads and interesting content, etc. And right up 100 years, 200 years later, this is Abraham Lincoln on the left, for those of you who don't know. Newspapers, as I said before, they got bigger, they had more pages. They were in major cities. There were hundreds, thousands of newspapers all over the country. Every city had a couple, morning paper and evening paper. And this continued right up until, I would say the 50s, the 60s. And newspapers were the only way to get the word out. There was no broadcast. So when Abraham Lincoln campaigned for president in 1860, first of all, no one advertised. He didn't even campaign. He sat on his porch. But when he wanted to get the word out, he sent a letter to a major newspaper. It was printed and then reprinted all over the country.